You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. Today is the 8th of December, 2015, here across the dateline in Japan. And today we're joined on the line from the United States by Jim Steele, who was a director and instructor at the Sierra Nevada Field Campus of San Francisco State University from 1985 to 2009, where he taught on plants and nature study, natural sciences for teachers, bird banding, and bird identification. He is also the author of a book, Landscapes and Cycles, An Environmentalist's Journey to Climate Skepticism. And he also runs a website along the same lines, landscapesandcycles.net. Of course, links to all of these resources will be in the show notes for today's interview at CorbettReport.com as usual. But let's bring him up on the program. Jim, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you, James, for having me on.
Well, I think probably we should start with a little bit about your background, and it is an intriguing title for your book, Landscapes and Cycles, An Environmentalist's Journey to Climate Skepticism. And I know one of the frequently asked questions in the sidebar of your website is, why would an environmentalist be a climate skeptic? And I think that's a good place to start this conversation for those who still believe that only oil-funded shills could possibly disbelieve the science of climate change. So let's talk a little bit about that. How did you come to be a climate skeptic, and tell us about how that plays into your position at the San Francisco State University Sierra Nevada Field Campus?
Well, a part of my position was doing research in the Sierra Nevada, and the U.S. Forest Service hired me to monitor bird life and a number of riparian meadow situations. And we had a meadow where there was a bird crash, population crash, and a lot of people said, "Oh my God, this is just what global warming says, and you're going to have a heating of the environment, and it's going to dry out a meadow." Well, it turned out as I looked at all this, it was a landscape issue. It was people had kind of screwed up the environment by changing the hydrology, changing the way the wetlands were. And as I looked into the temperature change, throughout all of the Sierra Nevada, temperatures were higher in the 30s if you look at maximum temperatures, and lower at our time. So it wasn't an issue of warming driving these animals into extinction. It was a matter of a landscape change that we were able to fix. We pushed for a whole watershed reconstruction. We brought birds back greater than any time I'd ever observed. And that got me thinking about all these other things. And so I started investigating some of the stuff that was being claimed in California, like butterflies and pica. And to me, all those studies turned out to be bogus. And there's two aspects to the whole global warming thing. One is how sensitive is our environment to CO2 and how catastrophic. And so I came into it from the point of view that, these claims that it's catastrophic are really misguided, and they're sort of being hyped. It's almost as if people are just jumping on a bandwagon without critically thinking. And I try to replicate a couple of studies. One of the iconic studies was by a person called Camille Parmesan, and she said, "Oh, look at all these butterflies are going extinct in California." And I knew some of those populations were near me, and it had nothing to do with climate change. It was usually to do with landscape change. So I tried to replicate it. She refused to give me her data. But in our bantering back and forth between her and her husband, they said, "Well, most of all of the papers, most of all the populations that we said have gone extinct during climate change, those populations have come back." And when I looked at pica, the same kind of thing is, it was a very short-term kind of problem that was being blamed for climate change and really had to do with other issues. And so I sort of, evolved from that point of view of looking at all these issues, from penguins to polar bears to anything that was being claimed to climate change. How much are we misguiding our conservation efforts by blending climate change as sort of the easy answer when it's really other issues? And from that's why I decided to write the book. And I sort of see myself as sort of a muckraker of that science. And a lot of those published claims that these animals are going extinct due to climate change, they just don't hold up. On my website and in the book, I try to document these very thoroughly. It's not always the easiest reading, but it's well documented to say that we are making a mistake. We're misguiding our conservation efforts by blaming climate change.
Well, I think that's an important point, because if we're blaming the wrong cause, then we're misdirecting resources that should be going to actual environmental preservation, but are instead being misdirected to a faulty idea. And again, there's so many different ways to approach this, and people who saw my recent video on the polar bear population might have seen that I linked to one of your articles on that topic in particular. Let's talk about a different species then. On your website, you also have a article on fabricating climate doom, hijacking conservation success in the UK to build consensus. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Well, that paper was probably a follow-up, and Camille Parmesan was again part of that, and I looked at some of her research, and she got acclaimed and invited to the White House as, here's a biologist that's showing this fingerprint of climate change, and she looked at a few populations that were shifting their ranges in England. And I knew a little bit about that just because I'm studying a lot of different species throughout the world and how they react to climate change. And they had a number of species that were going extinct because people were not engaging in some of the same practices they were agriculturally. And heavy grazing kept a very short grassland, which was good for a number of butterflies that like to have a very hot surface. And some of these butterflies also depend on ants that are dependent upon a very hot surface. And so when they saw they were going extinct, some people that did some real good work on this realized it was just as the turf started growing higher, it cooled the surface, and some of these butterflies couldn't exist anymore. And that was a good conservation efforts, and what they did is they started allowing more grazing to keep it short. They even mowed different places, and they were able to bring back a couple of species. And then what Parmesan did is she saw some of these, she saw one of the species moving northward, and she said, this is due to climate change, not landscapes. And she totally ignored all these conservation efforts to mow the grasslands to allow these species to exist, and allow them to move from where they've been pushed to the very southern boundaries of England further northward. And on my website, I name a number of things where good conservation efforts have been hijacked and pushed as evidence of climate change when it's really been evidence of how we've dealt with landscape changes to bring back species that have been threatened in some kinds of ways by human activities, but not by CO2.
Yes, and in fact, the polar bear population, one example of that, with the population having quintupled or so since the end of the open hunting that was taking place in the late 19th, early 20th century. And now we have this much larger population, but of course, the narrative is still that it's vulnerable because sea ice might melt sometime in the future. Very interesting. And of course, this also plays into a successful walrus conservation being hijacked by the climate change movement that you've written about as well. So lots of resources of that nature at landscapesandcycles.net. And I'll throw the links to those articles in the show notes for today's interview as well. But I wanted to talk to you specifically about a very recent article that you posted up about some new research about Antarctica that I did cover in an article on my website a month or so ago. But let's just refresh people's memory. Your article is entitled, "Is Antarctica's Climate Change Natural or CO2 Driven? There is absolutely no consensus." And that article starts by noting, the record growth of Antarctic sea ice has long been a troubling contradiction for global warming theory. But those who embrace CO2 as the driver of climate change typically countered that global warming was still melting the continental glaciers and raising sea levels. However, on October 29, 2015, a team of NASA researchers led by Jay Zwally published the paper, "Mass Gains of the Antarctic Ice Sheet Exceed Losses." If the new NASA research proves correct, and there is good evidence to suggest it is, continental ice is increasing and lowering sea level. That would highlight another major failure for both CO2-driven models and models of sea level change. The reaction of Dr. Theodore Scambos, senior research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, was all too reminiscent of the hide the decline mentality evidenced by advocacy scientists in the ClimateGate scandal. In an Al Jazeera interview, Scambos asked, "Please don't publicize this study." Others pushed back by simply listing any research that disagreed with Zwally, but rarely did they list the research supporting Zwally's results, nor did they delve into why there is no Antarctica consensus, as I will do here. So I hope people will go and read through this very detailed article, but perhaps you can give us an overview of why this really matters. What is the point here that has to do with the overall consensus about global warming itself?
It's a tad complicated in terms of, one of the major contradictions. All the CO2-driven models would say that Antarctic sea ice was going to decline, and just the opposite had happened. And so, how do you deal with that kind of contradictory evidence? Well, a lot of people said, "Well, we're still losing ice in Antarctica," and a lot of estimates of how sea ice is changing in Antarctica is dependent on how they measure how much ice was there in the past, how much the surface of Antarctica is rebounding or sinking due to past glacial, what they call glacial rebound. And what you're seeing is there's no consensus where most of the scientists will say that they really can't tell. There's just too much uncertainty. And the one way they check, they have these models of glacial isostatic rebound, meaning how much is the surface rising. And if they think it is risen a lot, then they subtract a certain amount of ice away from what they actually measure. And so a lot of times measurements that we're losing all this ice in Antarctica was dependent on these rebound models. Well, it turns out most of these rebound models were very faulty. And what this Zwally study was just showing is if you have a better accounting of the rebound, then we're actually gaining ice in Antarctica. And so this throws off this whole idea that, the sea level is rising due to global warming and it's, one part is in Greenland, the other part is in Antarctica, and this is going to cause these coastal catastrophes. But instead, what their study was saying was that we think that those models are wrong and that we are actually gaining ice in Antarctica. Now, the IPC models, they knew in East Antarctica we were not losing ice because it's too cold. The average temperature in the summer is minus 26 degrees. So you're not going to lose stuff there. But it's the balance of how much ice is being gained in East Antarctica versus how much is being lost in a few isolated spots around Antarctica where you have this warm water, this relatively warm water. It's actually very close to freezing, but it's insulated from the surface, the real cold surface where sea ice freezes, and it's about 300 meters below the surface. And every now and then it upwells, and where it can upwell and reach the bottom of a glacier, it melts the bottom. The glacier kind of surges forward. That causes a thinning in the glacier, and so you lose a little bit of mass. And people are blaming that on global warming and saying, but there are all these predictions. Well, we're in 100 years, 1,000 years, we're going to have this tremendous melt due to this kind of process. That process of melting these glaciers is very cyclical. And most people see it's tied to sensitivity to El Niños. And El Niños happen on cycles tied to this thing called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, where you have more El Niños for 30 years and then 30 years less. And you have more upwelling and less upwelling. They see it's good for, from a biologist, I got into this seeing how this upwelling for krill and everything else increases Antarctic productivity. But you have these cycles where you have this acceleration for 20 years and you have this deceleration. It's probably been going on for thousands of years. But what you see in the media, sort of people hype every time you see a little bit of acceleration in these small little areas where this upwelling melts glaciers. It's, oh, look, we're going to lose Antarctica and we're going to lose all, it's going to melt and raise sea levels and drown all the coasts. Where in fact what we're seeing is something cyclical, and it's being balanced by this increase in ice accumulation on East Antarctica. So there's really no alarmism, and it sort of highlights the point where if you look at all what the experts are truly saying, if you're looking at the consensus of the experts in Antarctica, there is no alarmism. There is no reason to kind of fear that all of a sudden this acceleration is causing a major threat. And most of these experts say we're really not sure how much is natural and how much has anything to do with CO2. But what people are bombarded with is this sense of, oh, look, there's this 5-year acceleration, so that's CO2 and we're all going to drown. And it's just ludicrous. It's just fear-mongering that makes us look at the wrong issues. And one thing I try to push in that article is people who are examining groundwater extraction, which everybody's doing, is sort of like they're extracting water to help their agriculture. The reason we don't have a dust bowl in the prairies of North America right now is because we're extracting enough water from the ground to kind of keep it irrigated. But as they do that, all this water is now increasing sea level. And if people are worried about sea level rise, it's probably groundwater extraction that is the issue that should attract our attention, and we should look at how to deal with this, because it does two things. It raises sea level, and it causes the ground to subside and go lower. And in California, we know in central California, it used to be considered a swampland back in the late 1800s, and now it's dried in agriculture. And as they've extracted all this groundwater, the ground is sunk by almost 100 feet. And I might be off on that number. I might be a little exaggerated. It's a tremendous amount of sinking. If we're truly to kind of want to conserve and make our environment more resilient, this is the issue we got to look at. But what I thought was like Obama was saying, oh, look at, here's this flooding, which was in Florida that he blamed on climate change. That is an area that is really subsided. The land is sunk due to this groundwater extraction. And the politics of this climate war is making us not understand the true nature of natural climate variability, the ways that humans are really causing change that we have to deal with. And it's putting it all on this CO2 battleground that I think is going to be disastrous for how we can really deal with the issues that are confronting us.
Well, that's a very important point, and it actually speaks to something that we've talked about here on the podcast before, where we talked about an article on how Nestle only pays $524 to extract 27 million gallons of California drinking water for its own purposes, and how that might be playing into what's happening in California more so than carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere. But I think you speak to a very important point here, which is if the consensus on, or the supposed consensus, which you do a good job of showing was not a consensus at all, on Antarctica was so wrong, and in fact the reverse of what is actually happening, that means that we know even less about sea level rise and what is contributing to it than was supposed, like we supposedly did. But that doesn't that speak to the point that these models that are projecting what's going to happen 50 or 100 years from now are fundamentally flawed, and thus again pointing us in the wrong direction?
Oh, absolutely, and that's part of my issue is that everybody thinks that these models are telling us. I've talked to people on the internet that just say, "Oh, we're all going to die because of CO2," and it's all because of these fundamentally flawed models. A lot of us say, "Well, we can't replicate, we can't simulate climate change unless we add CO2 to explain the warming." Well, that might be, and then they say, well, that shows that CO2 must be the true driver of climate change. Well, that's true if we really understand natural climate change, but we don't. We've been absolutely wrong about Antarctica in a number of different ways. And the scientists there, is what I try to show, is half of them say, I think all the evidence that CO2 is affecting Antarctica is weak, and we don't buy into it. But you can go into other issues. If you look at North America, the east side of North America has been cooling for 100 years. It has no correlation with CO2. it's just we don't really understand natural variability. And if you look at some of the other, you delve into the literature, see, we don't really understand how much warm water gets pumped from the tropical areas into the polar regions. And the Arctic is very susceptible to that. And a lot of the loss in the Arctic of sea ice and around Greenland has to do with the way heat is transported from the tropics, and it goes in cycles. And in the 30s through the 20s to the 40s, there was a whole import of warm water and warm water species into the Arctic. There was a lot of melting of ice. That cycle changed. It got cooler. They retreated. And then recently it went northward again. So we saw a lot of ice. What I'm predicting is within the next 15 years, you're going to see Arctic ice rebound back to what it was around in the 80s or 70s. You're going to see any species that move northward are going to go backwards just like they did in the 40s and 50s. And I think that will be the true test of these natural cycles, that we're going to see a change that is not being pushed by these models, and they're not even detected by these models because they don't understand natural variability.
Well, you raise so many important points in your articles, but just stepping back for a moment, given the type of work you're doing and the circles you move in, I imagine that you get quite a bit of kickback from a lot of people who would otherwise be your ally in conservation efforts, who instead have been diverted into the CO2-driven climate change hype and alarmism. What kind of feedback do you get about your work, and how do you deal with that?
People that know me, the dean of San Francisco, the past dean of the College of Science and Engineering, San Francisco State, he wrote the foreword to my book, and he's very supportive. He was also president of California Academy of Sciences. I've had a number of colleagues that are environmentalists that read the book and call it a masterpiece. If I go online and try to say some of this stuff to people who don't know me, they'll say, "Oh, you're just a tool of the Koch brothers. You're being funded by the oil industry." All this same kind of blah blah blah. And I just sit there in amazement that they don't know you, but they're just trying to, push you away. It's, I don't want to hear all this contradictory evidence. I just want to believe in gloom and doom. And it's sort of appalling that some people actually. I had one editor of the San Francisco Chronicle say, "Well, what you say might be true, but what I think Manus should get his upcomings, his comeuppance, and we're going to see the Gulf Stream shut down, and all the world's going to go to hell." And actually, they're cheering for this kind of thing. So for those people, I don't know how to deal with it. I just look at it and smile, and I know I get, people will attack me and say, I'm stupid, I'm lying, or whatever they want to say. But I knew that was coming. I knew as soon as I attacked this consensus idea, that was going to happen. And most of the people who attack me are people who have no science background. They sort of rely on a consensus to say, "Oh, I'm just saying what everybody else is saying." And when you attack the consensus, you're stripping them of all their support. You're sort of showing them that they're really naked and they don't understand the science, and they're just kind of leaning on what everybody else is saying. So those people who don't understand the science, they're going to come at me. But the people that understand the science, that know me, that understand what I'm saying, I've got very favorable reviews. So in terms of what's going to happen in this future, I think a lot of people are locked into it for a number of different reasons. A number of my friends are very left-wing. I came from a left-wing and going more to a libertarian perspective. But they said, "Well, you're just helping the right-wing guys." And I said, I'm trying to help the truth. What I really want to see is if we want to be good stewards in the environment, we have to have very good science, and we have to have science that people trust. And if we start doing these bogus reports that the world's going to hell due to CO2, and it proves wrong, it's a backlash against our attempts to be good, to have good conservation, good environmental science. But they're so politically driven that they just say, "Well, I can't believe it because I don't want to help the right wing." And I think the only thing that's going to kind of maybe switch this whole the politics of climate change, if I'm right, if based on the theories of how natural climate cycles are happening, if we see Arctic sea ice start to rebound. And actually, that's already happening. We've seen some thickening in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. That if that rebounds within the next 15 years, then I think people, they'll start to have to agree, well, okay, maybe we overstated this whole climate catastrophe thing. And all I can do is sit back and wait, because half the time I know once people are convinced politically that they're holding on to climate change as this issue that the left is sponsoring and the right is challenging, most people are they're based on their politics.
Yes, politics does seem to be the overriding factor for a lot of people who haven't even bothered to look at the science, but just assume that there is a consensus. And it is, you point out another interesting phenomenon where people who pretend to be very concerned about the melting of the ice caps and all of this find, for example, well, actually, Antarctica is gaining land ice, and they seem to be disappointed by this or fight vigorously against that good news, which makes you wonder what they're really interested in here, other than proving a point.
Absolutely, and it's not just the ice. It's, if I show them evidence that the polar bears are actually gaining in population, they don't want to believe it. And I show them the penguins are gaining in population. It bothers them. They want to see some kind of gloom and doom. And you look at them and I don't get it. I had some students come up to me in pika. They're sort of a rabbit-like creature that lives in the rock piles and mountains. And there have been some studies saying, the pika are all dying due to climate change. I said, and they asked me, do I see that around? So, well, we have some populations around here, but I don't see any change in the population. And they were disappointed, but they were in tears thinking, climate change is doing it. And then when I told them that the pike are actually doing well, and if you look at a lot of the studies, in the Sierra Nevada, they're doing perfectly well. And they're disappointed. They want to hear some bad news. If that's, I don't know, if it's like a horror movie gets her all our juices going. That's what they're looking for. And it just psychologically, it's sort of a puzzling amazement that I look at this. And I think maybe in 30 years from now, people are going to look back and see this mass psychology, and it will be a great study for people to see how people that are totally misinformed created these such strong opinions.
It's a very interesting phenomena, and I think there's a lot more to explore there. And I will let people explore your website, again, landscapesandcycles.net, as well as your book, Landscapes and Cycles, An Environmentalist Journey to Climate Skepticism. Again, all of the articles and resources we talked about today will be linked in the show notes at corbettreport.com. Jim Steele, very interesting work, very detailed, lots of information for people to digest. So thank you very much again for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, James, thanks so much for bringing this to people's attention, because it's something that people really need to understand. It's scientifically sound, and it's not as catastrophic as some of the media are pushing. So that you bring this to people's attention, I'm grateful. Thank you.